Welcome to the weekly worship service of the First Church in Boston, a Unitarian Universalist congregation in the Back Bay. The minister at First Church is Reverend Edmund Robinson. His sermon for today is entitled, "The Better Angels of Our Nature."
Good morning. Welcome to First Church in Boston. I'm Edmund Robinson, the interim minister, and welcome also to anyone who's watching us on YouTube, out on the internet, and we invite you to come down sometime and see us in person, but we're perfectly happy for you to attend church this way. Today we're celebrating Lincoln's birthday a week late, as we celebrated everybody else who had a birthday last week. So I'd like to say that it's peculiar that Abraham Lincoln occupies a place in the culture of the United States somewhat analogous to that of Abraham the patriarch in Jewish history in the Bible. In fact, I think I was 5 years old before I realized there were two separate people. I would call on Father Abraham for religious purposes, and also think that that was the same person that was the president during the Civil War. And I think that's his emotional status with us is best expressed by a short poem of Walt Whitman, with which I'll start. O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flying, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores are crowding. For you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear Father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead. Our opening hymn is We Shall Overcome. Number 169, I invite you to rise as in body or spirit to join us with that. please be seated? I light our chalice with the words from Christine Robinson. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. And I invite you to join us into the First Church affirmation, to rise as you are able, and we say it in unison with the words in the order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Thank you. Please be seated. Nope, not yet. Yes, it's on. Hooray. Announcements. The only one that I know of is that I will be offering this course on death and dying. It's something that none of us are going to actually escape, but some of us may want to face up to it a little earlier and make some plans in that regard. And then I think we have something about an organ recital.
Hey. We have a beautiful program that's been offered to us and paid for in its entirety by an international concert organ soloist. It came to me through a mutual friend, and he's very well known and he's amazing, and we still need your help. We need someone to house him for 3 nights, the 28th and the 1st and the 2nd. We don't need you for the 29th of February. We're all set for that. Okay, I'm waiting for you to get it. Out of town, or you know somebody that has a nice home outside the suburbs that would furnish him a way in, that's fine too, but he will not have a car. He just got back from Europe, touring all around there, and he's going back shortly after that. So this was the only window that we were able to have him. So if you can help us out in any way, I would really appreciate it. It's very important to the church because it'll raise money for our program. And we're also honoring Harvey Burgett, who was near and dear to many, many of you, and this recital is also in his honor. So please step up if you can and volunteer a friend if you can't. Thanks.
Are there any other announcements? Then I will move into joys and concerns. We're moving the joys and concerns to a little bit different place in the service than we have had them previously for logistical reasons that I need not go into. So I want to open the floor to anyone who wishes to come forward and tell us something that's happening in your life, remarkable or unremarkable, joyous or sorrowful or in between. Come on. David?
This may be, I'm sorry I didn't speak to you before this, but I have been in phone conversation with one of the most famously obscure people in America, Ellery F. Shemp, who lives in Medford. Ellery F. Shemp, as a teenager, objected to Bible reading because he was a Unitarian. They sued the school and got a ruling in his favor, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and his decision was responsible for ending official school prayer in schools. This June, will be the 60th anniversary of the decision, and I have invited him here, I'm sorry I didn't talk to you before this, to come and speak on the nearest Sunday to the 60th anniversary, which I believe will be June 18th or 17th. I don't have my calendar in front of me. So if you would like to see a teenager who changed the world and got a Supreme Court decision named after him without killing anybody, please come. It should be a pretty interesting thing. There's a book on it by a law professor at New York University Law School called Ellery's Protest by a man named Solomon, a rather appropriate name for a law professor.
Thank you. I bet you that will be exciting. He is a civil liberties hero, no question about that.
Well, I had a joy this morning. Walking along Beacon Street, there was a glorious witch hazel bush in bloom. It looks rather like forsythia, but it's like witch hazel, right along, kind of across from, sort of near where Cheers is. Anyway, that's beautiful. Another thing I've wanted to speak about for a long time is a joy that the independent bookstores seem to be flourishing in Boston. And please patronize Porter Square Books down in the Seaport District, which is a nice ramble. Beacon Hill Cafe, Bookstore Cafe, which is a delightful place on Charles Street. And Harvard Bookstore is moving into the spot that Barnes & Noble was in the Prudential Center. So those are all things that we should patronize as much as possible. David? And the Brattle Book on West Street, yep, and Trident over on Newbury Street. Yeah, anyway, here's to independent bookstores.
We're surrounded by bibliophiles. Anyone else?
Good morning. Please join me in today's responsive reading. It is number 586 in the back of your hymnal. The Idea of Democracy by Abraham Lincoln. As labor is the common burden of our race, so the effort of some to shift their share of the burden onto the shoulders of others is the great, durable curse of the race. As I could not be a slave, so I could not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Our reliance is in our love for liberty. Our defense is the spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all people in all lands everywhere. Destroy this spirit, and we have planted the seeds of despotism at our own doors. Why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? Let us have faith that right against might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. Thank you.
You all know that I come from South Carolina. My family was there for many, many generations before my lifetime. Of course, that would mean that my family actually did participate in slavery, which I'm not proud of, but it's a fact. And when I grew up in the 50s, there were still people around that were defending the Confederate position in the Civil War, the morality of having seceded. And they often said it wasn't about slavery. And that is just a bald-faced lie, which is belied by all of the documentary evidence, all of their secession conferences. Today's sermon will focus on these words I'm about to read from Lincoln's first inaugural on the eve of the Civil War, but before the states had seceded. Lincoln is put into position, taking the oath of office as president, and tries to persuade the southern states that they're better off waiting to see what happens than to rush headlong into secession. This is the concluding paragraph of that oration. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I'm loath to close. We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely there will be, by the better angels of our nature. Our sermon hymn is number 115, God of Grace and God of Glory. was by Harry Emerson Fosdick. What a preacher he was. The better angels of our nature. Last Sunday, I pointed out that this time of year presents us with convergences of notable people. So I talked about Charles Darwin, evolution and nature, and about St. Valentine and love, both erotic and non-erotic. I said that Darwin's theory of evolution, as we have come to understand it, supports the idea of love up to a point, but that the type of universal unconditional love preached by Jesus and touted in world's religions was a bit unnatural, but it pointed the way we would hope to evolve. That's only part of the story. We now have to add the third great figure from our February trilogy, Abraham Lincoln. What does Lincoln have to do with either love or nature? To answer that question, I wanted to try to unpack this arresting phrase Lincoln used in his first inaugural address, the better angels of our nature. What does that mean? What is better? Does this mean morally better or more skillful? Our word angel comes from the Greek angelo, which means messenger. Who dispatches Lincoln's angels, and does that give us a clue as to how the divine interacts with nature? Lincoln spoke these words on March 4th, 1861, after he had taken the oath of office. The nation teetered on the brink of dissolution. What did he mean, the better angels of our nature? It would help if we set that in context. I'm aided in this context setting by a recent book by Jill Lepore, a Harvard historian and writer for The New Yorker, entitled These Truths. It is a one-volume history of the United States from Columbus's landing to the present day. In it, Professor Lepore looks at the values contained in the Declaration of Independence and how these ideals have intersected with the realities on the ground as the country developed. So the first piece of context for Lincoln's first inaugural address is the Declaration of Independence, which in the process of justifying the rebellion against Great Britain claimed as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Logically, this is two levels of statement. One is a claim about the status of people, and the other is a claim for the truth of the first statement. Groucho Marx once said, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eye?" Our common experience gives us a certain trust in facts we can perceive with our five senses, and so propositions like "it is raining outside" can justly be called self-evident. But the equality of all people is not in that category. Jill Lepore argues, as I have argued in a previous sermon, that the equality of all people cannot be a statement which is self-evidently true because so many Americans over the course of our history have refused to accept it as true. The equality of all people was not evident to the European colonizers of North America as they pushed the indigenous peoples of this continent from their land without legal cause. The equality of men and women was not evident to the men who denied women a say in their government while allowing men such power. And by the middle of the 19th century, it had become crystal clear that it was not evident to slaveholders that the human beings they order around unconditionally are the equal of their so-called masters. The golden rule, to treat others as we would want to be treated, was not only preached by Jesus, but is found in most of the major religions of the world. It is utterly inconsistent with the system of chattel slavery, which used to prevail in America and which was ended by the military force of the Union victory in the Civil War. We know that now, Lincoln in 1861 could not have known how the war would come out. It is the great paradox of American history and black history that most of the white men who signed a document stating a self-evident truth that all people are created equal themselves enslaved people. Moreover, those who supported legal systems of enslavement justified the enslavement by inventing a type of racial differentiation, claiming that people of African descent were constitutionally inferior to those of European descent. This racism pervaded politics in the early 19th century, and it became impossible to have a dispassionate discussion. Congress itself, the highest deliberative body in the nation, imposed a gag rule so that the morality of slaves, but nobody was talking between the sides. Jill Lepore holds that there was virtually no place for honest and robust debate on the status of slavery under the U.S. Constitution until 1850. Up to Douglas's speeches and delivering his own speech in rebuttal, but the crowds that came to hear Douglas would not stay to listen to Lincoln. So Lincoln proposed publicly to Douglas that they have a series of debates, and to everyone's surprise, Douglas accepted. The debates were printed in the daily newspapers and became favored readings among the public. They were the first serious look in decades on the crucial issue absorbing the nation, whether human slavery was allowed under the Declaration of Independence and or the Constitution, and whether it could be practiced in the new territories being added to the Union. Douglas argued that the signers of the Declaration of Independence, white men and their posterity forever, unquote. In effect, Douglas maintained that the purpose of the government was to maintain white supremacy. Douglas charged Lincoln with being a zealot, which Lincoln denied. Quote, "I will say here that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so," end quote. Douglas had also charged that Lincoln believed in the equality of the races. Lincoln replied, quote, "I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the black and the white races, but I hold that, notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," end quote. Douglas further argued that Lincoln's assertion that blacks were included in the Declaration of Independence was a slander on Thomas Jefferson. And Lincoln replied that the entire records of the world could be searched and not turn up one scrap of evidence that the Negro was not included in the Declaration, unquote. Lincoln also reminded the audience that while Jefferson certainly owned slaves, it was Jefferson who told a friend that he, quote, "trembled for his country when he remembered that God is just," unquote. So we have our first piece of context for Lincoln's first inaugural, the Declaration of Independence. And the second was the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The third is the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was born into slavery, but he was carried into a free state. He sued for his freedom. The case made its way through the courts until it finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. It is, by common consent of legal scholars, the worst Supreme Court opinion in the history of the country. A court is often faced with several lines of reasoning to reach a result. In the modern era, most Supreme Court opinions will not decide a constitutional question if there is a narrower ground for decision. Chief Judge Taney turned that rule on its head, as if he were deciding not only whether Dred Scott was entitled to be a free man, but also the justice of all the arguments for and against slavery. In the course of the decision, the court ruled invalid the Missouri Compromise, which set the whole nation back several squares in trying to balance the interests of slaveholders with abolitionists in the new territories. Most critics, Justice Taney ruled along the lines that Stephen Douglas had asserted in his debate with Lincoln, that there was no evidence that the Founding Fathers considered blacks as persons under the law. This despite the fact that many states, such as Massachusetts, allowed free males of color to vote. This crucial point of law rested on no evidence whatsoever, merely the say-so of the Chief Justice. It is hard to imagine a more despotic result. For the duration of the Civil War, and until the post-war constitutional amendments were enacted, the Dred Scott case imported white supremacy officially into U.S. law. A fourth piece of context is the election of 1860, which was almost an extension of the Lincoln-Douglas debates about the Constitution and slavery. The Democratic Party held its convention in Charleston, but they divided quickly into a minority, northern faction, and a majority, southern one. The majority endorsed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution And Lincoln, though a dark horse, won the nomination. Then the Democrats reconvened in Baltimore, found themselves still stalled, but ultimately parties, a Southern one and a Northern one. The Northern Democratic Party nominated Douglas, and the Southern Party nominated U.S. Senator John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Because the Democratic Party vote was split, the Republicans had an advantage. Lincoln won every northern state, all 6 states in which the Lincoln-Douglas debates had been published, and all 4 states in which black men could vote. He won no states in the South, and there was unrest in the North, including attacks on abolitionists. In the South, people began to talk seriously about secession. Although the U.S. Constitution has pretty clear procedures for admitting new states into the Union, it is completely silent on whether and under what circumstances from the Union. This is what Lincoln faced as he took the oath of office on March 4th, 1861, an incipient rebellion. His address reads today like a legal argument. He was a gifted lawyer and had an exceptional talent for making a complicated issue sound simple. In the opening paragraphs, he basically tries to assure the slave-holding states that he is not coming for their slaves. He quotes the position he took in the Douglas debates, that he does not have any purpose to interfere with slavery in those states where it is lawful, and does not think he has any right to do so. He also quoted the Republican platform to similar effect, quote, resolved, this is the Republican platform that he ran on, resolved that the maintenance inviolate of the rights of the states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgment exclusively, is essential to that balance of power on which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric depend, and we denounce the lawless invasion by armed force of the soil of any state or territory, no matter what pretext, as among the gravest of crimes, quote, end quote. That's the quote from the Republican platform that Lincoln had run on. It's one of history's greatest ironies. The rhetoric of the Republican platform, which Lincoln cites in his inaugural, is almost identical to the guarantee of rights and property which the Southern faction of the Democrats had insisted upon, an insistence which split that party and elected Lincoln. He then goes on to deal with the question of fugitive slaves and says the Constitution makes explicit provision for returning them to servitude. Then Lincoln gets philosophical. He maintains that the entire scheme of the Constitution is a union that is perpetual. Of course, as I pointed out a minute ago, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about the duration of the union or any one state's right to leave it. He also tries to make the case that separation will be messy at best, using an example which might have been from his law practice. Quote, physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them, end quote. Then he wraps up with a plea to the seceding states to wait and see what develops. He has tried his carrots. In the next of the paragraph, he hints at his stick. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. Unquote. Here is what Lincoln comes back to in the months and years ahead. The Constitution nowhere explicitly says that the union created by it shall be eternal, or that a state, once it has joined the union, cannot unjoin it. The only thing in the language of the Constitution that gives the government created there any authorization for the use of force to prevent a secession is in the President's oath of office. President to preserve, protect, and defend the country. It is noteworthy that the oath is prescribed in so many words in the Constitution, and that it is so terse, but it is a very thin thread on which to hang the bloodiest war in American history. If this president or another one thought that negotiations or appeasement of the slave powers would best preserve the Union, this oath would not stand in the way of such conduct that history would honor. We all like to feel that the good guys won, and the fact that the 13th Amendment was passed, settling for once and for all that slavery was abolished in America, and that the 14th and 15th followed in quick succession, makes it easier to justify the horrendous cost borne by the Americans on both sides of the conflict. And so we come, we 21st century explorers, into the last paragraphs of Lincoln's first inaugural address. Our orator has decided to try to end on a hopeful note, a note of unity. Quote, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." This language envisions a musical piece, a song or sonata or symphony, or maybe the angelic chorus heard by the shepherds outside of Bethlehem. The mystic chords of memory are meant to invoke our common history, the land for which our forefathers and mothers lived and died. It hints at the graves of Revolutionary War veterans, but also those of the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, even the blood-stained fields of Kansas in the lead-up to the Civil War. The living and the dead join in this swelling chord, which stirs the memory and makes us understand we have been friends before and can be again. But what about those angels? Surely they will touch those chords of memory and make them resound deeper in the American soul. As far as we know, Abraham Lincoln belonged to no church, but among all our presidents down to the present one, he grappled most publicly with real religious questions. He was a crafty and subtle writer, an astute politician. And it's hard to guess his real theological leanings, but Gary Wills, who wrote a book on the Gettysburg Address, concluded that Lincoln was most accurately described as a transcendentalist. His law partner, William Herndon, read the Transcendentalists and was fond of quoting our own Unitarian forebear, Theodore Parker, as Lincoln used Parker's phrase of government of the people, by the people, and for the people to close out his oration at Gettysburg. Theodore Parker belonged to the second generation of Transcendentalists. Transcendentalists are philosophical idealists. They know that a statement like, "all men are created equal," is an ideal which will always be realized imperfectly in the real world. We have fallen short and will continue to fall short of its full promise. But the ideal once stated has a power of its own, a power which brought on a terrible swift sword, which set brother against brother and buried the flower of a generation in graveyards throughout the South. It was a terrible price to pay, but it rid the nation of the practice of slavery, at least overtly, if not of its long moral stain, which is the racism with which we continue to be afflicted. I don't know that Lincoln was a transcendentalist or a Unitarian, but someone who writes the phrase, "the better angels of our nature," is taking a theological stand. St. Augustine read St. Paul and came up with the idea of original sin, a stain which is so basic that only the narrowest of winners gets into heaven. In the Reformation, John Calvin weaponized original sin by declaring that humans were inherently depraved and even fewer of them would make it into heaven. Against these gloomy prophets, our Unitarian and Universalist forebears rebelled, including some who have served this very church. We want, for the possibility to exist that we might be visited by our better angels, that we might be drenched in self-righteousness and ready to fire the cannons against those we have persuaded ourselves are our mortal enemies, though they were once friends. And just before we hit send on that email, bing, the better angel of our nature, is sitting on our keyboard and says, do you really want to start that Civil War all over again? Now, a word about the second inaugural, because we're not quite, the first inaugural doesn't quite tie it all together. It took place on March the 4th, 1865, a little over a month before the war ended at Appomattox. It is peculiar in American history in the depth of its theological speculation. Normally, when American presidents invoke God, it is window dressing. They know that their audiences have different ideas about God, and for most of the time, there's no benefit to a president from stirring up purely theological controversies. But the nation before Lincoln in March of 1865 was bleeding. And though we know now that peace was a month away, Lincoln acted and spoke as if the war could continue for years more. He talked about how both sides prayed to the same God, but that God could not answer the prayers of each side. That picture of a nonpartisan God was quickly followed by God who could not endorse slavery. Quote, "It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged," unquote. And quote, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him," unquote. This God that Lincoln has just described is a God, a fountain of vengeance, a terrible swift sword. It is also worth noting in passing that Lincoln's phrase, "the believers in a living God," avoids the question of whether Lincoln himself is a believer, numbered among those believers. He is using God as God is often conceived as a rhetorical foil, but he is not adopting a belief in God for himself. Then finally, he wraps up the theological speculations of the second inaugural with a benediction as to how the humans listening to him must treat one another in the aftermath of this conflagration. Quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." That was 1865. There's still a lot of work to do to realize Abraham Lincoln's dream. President Biden echoed it. He said, "Let's finish the job." Amen. Now let's take our offering for the benefit of this church.
If you'd like to support the work of this church with a financial donation, you may write out a check to First Church Boston and mail it to 66 Marlborough Street, 02116. You can also donate via text. Simply text the dollar amount, 5, 10, 20, etc., to 617-917-5610. You will receive confirmation by email. Thank you.
I invite you to join me in extinguishing the chalice with the words in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Do we have an organist? Oh, we have a pianist. Good. Then let's sing 162. Gonna lay down my sword and shield. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Amen. Blessed be. Go in peace.
Please feel free to join us live each Sunday at 66 Marlborough Street at the corner of Berkeley Street in Back Bay. If you'd like more information about programs, services, or membership at First Church, please visit the website www.firstchurchboston.org or send an email to office@firstchurchboston.org.